Hi, my name is Dr. Alicia Cabrera Prado, and I am here to talk about reimagining U.S. dual language teacher training with a teach abroad experience. Uh, Now, I'm going to talk about the problem, the methodology, the findings, and the conclusions. Overall, there's a lack of diverse U.S. training in diverse U.S. dual language classrooms. I use narrative inquiry, and I'm going to compare the study with a teach abroad experience both here in the U.S. and in Spain. And then I'm going to discuss conclusions and implications for future research. So overall, the dual language programs in the US, there are over 3,000 and they have a variety of languages available. The most common being Spanish. And then there is a steep rise in the English programs in Spain, which brings me to NALCAP, which is the North American Language and Culture Teaching Assistance Program, which brings Americans over into Spain to be the linguistic experts, if you will, in English in the classroom to aid the teachers with the students learning the L2 or 3 in whichever case it happens to be. Now, there is a lack of teachers for these programs in both countries, which is why Spain decides to import Americans to help with that. And then we also outsource a lot of our teachers, or we bring a lot of teachers in from a variety of different countries in order to fill those gaps within those classrooms. Now, a policy for teachers to go abroad doesn't really exist, and teachers by and large differ ethnically, linguistically, and culturally from their students, especially here in the US, in our very diverse classrooms. And there is a perpetuation of a monoglossic language ideology, which language is taught in a deficit model in which you are supplanting with the other language. Now you can see for the study abroad trends overall in the past few years or the past 20 years. The purple band is the education majors, and you can see that is one of the smaller bands, as well as it has gone decreased over time. And you can see those trends here. Obviously, the pandemic had an impact on that, but they have decreased exponentially over when the pandemic hit versus they started to kind of bounce back a little, but nowhere near where they once were. Even 3%, very small, but some of the students were going abroad. Now, my study is unique in that it did occur during the pandemic, which is why I focused on some of the NELCAP participants, because even though it was the pandemic, they still brought over about 4,000 Americans during that time to aid in classrooms in Spain. Now, you can see here that the teachers differ ethnically from the students that they serve. And what this means is that their teachers are not the same background, either ethnically, culturally, or linguistically. And there's a nuance to language that exists that needs to be honed and honored in the classroom in order to counteract those hegemonic discourses and disrupt that perpetuation of the monoglossic language ideologies. And about 80-ish percent of the teachers are white or European identifying, and you could see that exponentially that is the greatest source of the teaching population. And then by and large, the student population is about 54-ish percent of a minoritized population here in the US. Now, the gaps in literature are really more about the lack of research in dual language classrooms, and especially in regards to study abroad. And then there is not a ton on translanguaging that is coming into its own right now. And you're seeing more studies around it, but there is still a lack of understanding, at least from the teacher side, about those ideologies as well as practices in the classroom and what that looks like and feels like, as it is a newer body of work. And then there is that linguistic lens that exists, not in the context of teaching the target language. Now, the research questions are: what were the experiences of the NALCAP participants in Spain regarding language use? What are the experiences of the Spanish participants in the US regarding language use? And then what can we gain about the current state of dual language instruction by comparing these experiences with the two groups of participants? Um, so first off, for the research, I used narrative inquiry and I allowed the participants to discuss their lived experiences in unfamiliar spaces. And it was a holistic examination of their beliefs around language and teaching. I used a critical consciousness was the lens along with dynamic bilingualism. And then I used open encoding and iterative coding. And then I compared again the NELCA participants in Spain's experience to those Spaniards that were in the US teaching in dual language classrooms. So when we're talking about language, they're the other in their respective teaching experiences. And the purpose was to dissect their experiences in unfamiliar spaces while navigating not only teaching, but language and living in a new space. And the tenets of critical consciousness with a focus on dynamic bilingualism by aligning the dynamic bilingualism and via translanguaging, the students were more empowered in their linguistic identities, and that facilitated critical consciousness by reflecting on the deficit narratives around language. Now, I do identify I have an insider outsider status. I am a Cuban American, so I live life within the hyphen here in the US. I do speak Spanish. I grew up speaking Spanish. I was educated in English, however, and I also am an avid traveler and I've been all over the world. And I think that's an important aspect to not only my identity, but part of how I come to think about language and language instruction. And then the other piece is I am white passing, and so I have a different experience than some of my other counterparts. For the participants, there were 3 Americans that I interviewed that taught in Spain in those classrooms, as well as 3 Spaniards that came to the US to teach in dual language classrooms here in the Chicagoland area. Now, for the Spaniards, it was difficult for them to get a job in Spain because now there is that renaissance of language, especially those native or regional dialects. And none of the participants knew the regional dialect, so it was very hard to get a teaching placement within Spain, which is why they came to the US in order to facilitate a language or a teaching experience where they had more say in where they were placed. Some of the limitations the lack of people participating in NALCAP that wanted to teach. So my biggest hurdle was finding participants that wanted to teach or were trained teachers and took on this experience in order to aid in their linguistic flexibility or acuity. And then obviously with teaching, there are some gender roles involved in that. And most of the participants, all but one, were female. I did not find any trilingual Spaniards. Again, if they have a regional dialect, they have a far easier time getting a placement in Spain. But the Spanish government does decide where you get to teach. It's not something that you look at different districts like we do here and apply for different jobs. The government places you where they want you to teach. So the other aspect is that it would be hard to reproduce because, again, this study occurred during the pandemic. So those are very specific time or constraints on ability and even talking to people. A lot of it was via Zoom because of the different aspects of the pandemic at the time. Now, what are the experiences of the NELCAP participants? They all studied abroad, all of not during this, but in their college or in their training. And they realized that they still didn't feel comfortable enough to consider themselves prepared to teach in the other language. So they sought out these opportunities in order to hone their L2s. The Americans noticed a use of British English in Spain, and then the Spaniards also needed that flexibility. So in order to choose who they associated with was very purposeful, so they were able to practice their Spanish. So nothing, everything from roommates to who they chose to socialize with, etc., was with the marked purpose of practicing their Spanish. And then they all tutored students outside of class for extra money. NELCAP does provide a stipend, but in order to do the different things that they wanted to do while in country, they all tutored students in order to have some more monetary flexibility. For the Spaniards in the US. It was the same thing. They needed to adapt to a more American English, and they also needed to adapt to a more global Spanish. One of the participants didn't realize that other Spanish-speaking countries had different words for things that obviously she grew up in Spain. She assumed everyone spoke the same kind of set Spanish. And it wasn't until that she was here she realized that other countries had other words and other phrases and even colloquialisms that she wasn't exposed to until she was here in the United States. Now, they accepted Spanglish or translanguaging from students socially, but they still clung to that ideology of academic Spanish. Now, what insights can we gain? Monoglossic language ideologies pervade in both spaces. Spain had an English-only policy in which, when the students were interacting with the NELCAP participants, they were only allowed to use English, and the participants were even told to not let the students know that they understood or spoke any Spanish. So there was that disconnect about language and language usage, especially language learners. And the US is the same. There was time to speak English and a time to speak Spanish. So language was kept in silos instead of allowing the students to utilize all language in their repertoire. So there is a distinct lack of training around language and language ideologies, especially with translanguaging and dynamic bilingualism. Those ideologies seem to be missing from their training and or their classrooms. So the frame was critical consciousness, and it forces them to kind of take action and realize the language they're using and the purpose of that language. Dynamic bilingualism is the ability for anyone to use their entire linguistic repertoire. And then the teachers all did report themselves learning with the students. More training is needed in those different language ideologies as students and teachers are kind of navigating those linguistic spaces together. And again, Spanglish is accepted socially, but not academically. And then the teachers' opinions mirror the studies. And then the one pervasive thing is that the home vernacular or those words or phrases they use at home were considered incorrect or needed to be corrected in order to be more quote unquote academic. So again, they needed more linguistic fluency, and they chose to teach abroad in order to gain that linguistic acuity. So one of the participants said, "My English doesn't work here." So what she grew up learning it wasn't useful here in the States because they learned a very British way of communicating with certain phrases and even vocabulary. And then one of the American participants said she wasn't ready to be a teacher, but I wasn't unprepared to teach. So her program prepared her for teaching in the nuts and bolts of the teaching, but not really getting in front of students and navigating all of those different spaces, especially with language and language learning. Again, they all expressed learning with the students, and they were still fixated on the academia or academic Spanish instead of really meeting the students where they were at or honoring the words that they used in home or in their own countries. They were considered non-academic or needed to be corrected. All participants expressed using translanguaging, but did not receive any training on those ideologies, so they hadn't really labeled it. But again, they still didn't see the benefit of it. So there has to be more teacher training that aligns with not only translanguaging, but how students and teachers are using language. And then there's that perpetuation of the double monoglossic mode and having the languages in silos. So recommendations, increase program to include teaching abroad opportunities, offer in-depth training for teachers in dual language, and then also have maybe a pre and post effects on language acquisition with these experiences as we are not in pandemic era. And then also more studies to determine the efficacy of a teach abroad experience in the context of dual language classrooms. Now, Life Within the Hyphen, this was 2023. So this was when Bad Bunny opened the Grammy Awards in the US. And you can see that the closed captioning, instead of providing a bilingual closed captioner or even having it ready, it read speaking in non-English, singing in non-English. So many students are, including myself, exist on two different playing fields, and they're not always equal in the US, as you can see here. And while the ubiquity of Spanish is apparent by signage, food, etc., you still have these moments where it says speaking in non-English, singing in non-English. And so in a seemingly innocuous moment, really became a, a huge conversation starter around equity and inclusion and what it means to be bilingual in the US. So, a concerted effort must be made to honor and learn from each other in these classrooms and recognize that home vernacular a to is useful and helps combat the pervasive deficit ideologies. And reaching critical consciousness within the context of dynamic bilingualism is a journey. So, to those of us living within the hyphen in the United States, it's also about making space for both language at home, in our communities, and in our schools. And in order to truly celebrate language and culture, linguistic flexibility must be honored and even honed through travel to other countries to live and work. Teachers can begin the journey beyond the textbook definition of what linguistic acuity looks like for students and that live with their feet planted in firmly in two different linguistic worlds that often collide. Obviously, we've made some inroads as the Super Bowl was all in Spanish, and the closed caption was fixed for the Super Bowl, but it was still in Spanish, and there was still uh, a lot of talk and or complaints that it was not translated into English. Uh, but thank you for your time. I also have here my email or phone, or you can leave a comment on the channel and I will get back to you. Thank you for your attention. And if you need, here are some of the references that I used. Thank you.